Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sir Franz, and I would like to welcome you to our first lesson in Anatomy and Physiology. So, the goal of this lesson is to reorient us or to allow us to remember some of the more important biology concepts that we need to master and have a working knowledge of in order to understand how the human body functions. So the first illustration here shows us how from the simplest forms of matter, man is made. So this is the organization of the human body. So we start off with atoms. Number one, atoms will combine with each other to form molecules. And in the human body, there are certain groups of molecules that make up the components of the cell. We call those macromolecules or big molecules. And we have four macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So those four will combine with each other to form the components of the cell. For example, we have here a smooth muscle cell which has a plasma membrane surrounding it. That plasma membrane is made up of lipids, in particular phospholipids and cholesterol. So I hope you understood how macromolecules combine to form the components of the cell. Next, a cell is made up of macromolecules, and it is the functional and anatomic unit of the human body. So at its simplest, the cell will be able to perform the functions of life. Cells will combine with other cells to form tissues. So tissues consist of similar types of cells that work together, each type of cell contributing a particular function, so that as you combine all of those functions of the cell, you will have a unified function of the tissue. So for example, if we combine lots of smooth muscle cells with cells that carry oxygen and cells that conduct the red blood cells, in particular capillaries, together with smooth muscle cell, together with fibroblasts or cells that make collagen, all of those will combine to form the tissue, which is a smooth muscle tissue in this case. Okay? Different types of tissues will then combine to form an organ. So for example, we have here a blood vessel, okay, as the organ. The blood vessel is composed of epithelial tissue, in particular the endothelium, surrounded by smooth muscle tissue, which is able to contract, and further surrounded by supportive connective tissue, which imparts tensile strength. So, the epithelial tissue will interact with the blood cells. The smooth muscle tissue will produce contraction so that the blood vessel will be able to dilate and constrict, and the connective tissue will impart supportive functions. Here in the connective tissue, you will find nutrition for the blood vessel, and at the same time, here in the connective tissue, you will find tensile support so that the blood vessel will be able to return to its normal shape when distended and will not break or rupture easily. Organ, um, again, is made up of tissues, and if we combine different organs, we will be able to produce an organ system. So here, if we combine different blood vessels, the red ones are arteries and the blue ones are veins, combine that with the heart, you will have the cardiovascular system. The heart serving as a pump and the blood vessels serving as a conduit through which blood will flow. Okay? And when we combine organ systems, kapag ating pinagsama-sama ang mga organ systems ng isang tao, we will be able to form an organism. Okay? So combine the cardiovascular system for circulation with the musculoskeletal system for movement, with the respiratory system for oxygenation, kasama na dyan ang ating endocrine system for hormones, gastrointestinal tract or system for digestion and absorption of food, the central nervous system for coordination of neural activity. Dagdag mo na din dyan ang ating urinary system for the production and elimination of urine, and the immune system for control of infection. We'll be able to produce the organism, which is the human in this case. So again, this slide tells us how from the simplest form of matter, which is the atom, we form molecules. Molecules combine with each other to form the components of the cell. And then the cell will combine with other cell types to form the tissue. And the tissue will combine with other tissues to form an organ. The organ combining with other organs to form the organ system. And the organ system combining with other organ systems to form the organism. And as you observe, the level of structural complexity and functional complexity increases as you go high up the level of organization. Next, let's review the components of the cell. So, ang pinapakita dito is the generalized animal cell. So here, the purple structure, which is an organelle, inside the cell is the nucleus. So the nucleus contains the nuclear material or genetic material from which we make proteins through the process of the central dogma. So kung titingnan ninyo, ang nucleus na ito, it is composed of a nucleoplasm right here, a more condensed portion of the nucleus called the nucleolus, and it is surrounded by an envelope called the nuclear envelope. And as you observe, the nuclear envelope has holes in it. So the messenger RNA that is produced here inside the nucleus goes out into the cytoplasm. And after going out into the cytoplasm, the messenger RNA produced by the nucleus interacts with the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which is this set of envelope-like material. Eto. So, kung mapapansin ninyo, isa siyang network, para siyang maze, which is studded with these red dots we call the ribosomes. So, the messenger RNA that is produced from the DNA here in the nucleus exits and interacts with the rough endoplasmic reticulum, in particular with the studs of ribosomes, itong mga pula. These ribosomes then use the messenger RNA to make proteins. So the ribosomes are protein-making machinery. Okay? So once the proteins have been made by the ribosomes, they then continue their travel inside the cell here in the Golgi apparatus, where the proteins are modified. So dadagdagan ng sugar yung protein na iyon, dadagdagan ng fat yung protein na iyon, at babalutin by lipid to form these vesicles. So the Golgi apparatus is technically para siyang kung ikaw ay magsha-Shopee, yung order mo ay nandun sa sorting facility no? So yung Golgi apparatus, siya yung sorting facility ng cell. Okay? And etong vesicles, these will then be able to travel from one portion of the cell to another or be secreted by fusing with the cell membrane. Okay? And so when it fuses with the cell membrane, the vesicles will then release its contents. Okay. So, sinabi ko kanina that the vesicles and the protein products inside the cell will be able to move from one portion of the cell to the other. And that is by virtue of the microtubule system. Ito. Okay, kung mapapansin nyo itong mga white filaments na ito, they will align with each other much like yung riles ng tren. Okay? And on top of those lines, the vesicles and the protein products will glide until they reach another portion of the cell. So what I have just described is how the cell from DNA in the nucleus produces proteins and how those proteins become continuously processed and transported within the cell and out of the cell. No? So we have encountered already the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus, as well as the cell membrane. So what differentiates the rough endoplasmic reticulum from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum? It's the presence of ribosomes. And the function of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum would be to perform metabolism, no? Particular lipid metabolism. So how the cell processes fats, it's inside the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The cytosol is basically the liquid portion of the cell. So dito nadi-dissolve yung kung ano-ano, nutrients, wastes, protein products, and even cellular aggregates whenever the cell becomes diseased or injured. The lysosome, together with the peroxisome, are organelles of the cell which perform intracellular digestion. So yung mga sira na components ng cell, they will go inside the lysosome, and the lysosome, because it has digestive enzymes, will degrade those components and release back into the cell the macromolecules that the cell will need for making organelles again. The mitochondrion will produce adenosine triphosphate, which will then go out of the mitochondrion and interact with proteins of the cell as a source of energy. Okay? So that is our short review of basic cell biology. Next, shown here would be a closer look at the cell membrane. Okay? So, I'd like you to focus on the cursor. This is one type of lipid that we call phospholipid. And yung bilog ng phospholipid would be the phosphate group, and yung strands niya would be the fatty acids. Okay? So, the phospholipid will interact with other phospholipids to form the cell membrane. And they interact in a particular way. So that the polar head, which is made up of phosphate, interacts with extracellular water, so water outside the cell, and the fatty acid tails will interact with the other fatty acid tails to form a hydrophobic layer. So this layer here is hydrophilic, and this layer here made up of fatty acids and cholesterol, which is this one, is hydrophobic. And the other side, which is made up again of the polar head, phosphate, interacts with intracellular water. So kung mapapansin nyo, yung cell membrane technically separates the two water components. You have the extracellular fluid, which is water, and the intracellular fluid, which is water. So here, the phospholipids will form a bilayer. And so the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer structure, where the middle of the bilayer structure is made up of fatty acid tails, which are hydrophobic. Okay? So you also have here certain sets of proteins. So we call these proteins integral or integral, yung spelling niya, integral proteins, because they insert throughout the layer of the cell membrane. Okay? So these integral proteins will then interact with the cytoskeleton inside the cell. Yung sinabi ko kaninang microtubules, intermediate filaments, and actin filaments. So, anong nangyayari doon? Whenever there is a process that allows or communicates with the integral protein, that information is translated and carried over through the filaments of the cytoskeleton. So for example, whenever a cell comes in contact with another cell, that pressure of contact is transmitted into the cytoskeleton. And that is how that single cell knows na meron siyang katabi, no? That it is in contact with another structure. Okay, so whenever you have cancer, for example, so this is quite advanced, it's pathophysiology. Whenever you have cancer, the cell will not be able to perceive the presence of a nearby cell. So, because hindi niya naiintindihan na meron siyang katabing cell, it will grow over that cell and pervade that cell. No? So, there is loss of contact inhibition whenever you have cancer. I'd like you also to focus on these yellow structures here. These are molecules of cholesterol. And together, they make the cell membrane stable. So they make the cell membrane flimsy, so it can be distended, but at the same time, it makes the cell membrane sturdy. No? So it imparts a solid nature and a fluid nature to the cell membrane. You can also see here that some of the proteins and even the phospholipids, there is an associated sugar group. So these sugar groups orient themselves into the extracellular fluid or the outer space, and this is how the immune system recognizes that the cell is part of the self, okay? Because of that sugar group. So for example, if there is a bacterial cell which is an invader, a pathogen, iba yung sugar group na kanyang ini-express. So malalaman ng katawan na hindi yan galing dito, hindi yan parte ng human body. Okay? Next, let's review how cells are bound to each other. So I'd like only to focus on the tight junction and the desmosome. Okay? So, the tight junction technically binds two cells together. Okay? So dito, this is already impermeable, which means that the molecules here will not be able to penetrate this one. And so it is a tight seal, no? So because of this tight seal, we now have orientation of the cell. So if this is an epithelial cell of, for example, the gastrointestinal tract, because of this tight junction, nahati mo yung isang cell mismo, no? You separated the cell into an apical portion and a base lateral portion. So because of the tight junction, again, one cell is divided into an apical portion and a basolateral portion. So because this is impermeable, it is only through passing into the cell itself that the molecules are able to penetrate the human body. So for example, meron kang sodium ion dito. Yung sodium ion, hindi siya makakatagos dito. So the only way by which the human body is able to absorb that sodium ion is by passing through the cell. And so the cell can dictate if it will want to absorb the sodium ion or not. No? So that is a mode of control. For example, if inside the human body the sodium ion level is going down, it will then increase its absorption of sodium through sodium channels here. Kung sakto lang naman yung sodium sa loob ng katawan, the sodium channels will then go down, no? It will not become available so that hindi mo maa-absorb yung sodium. So the sodium level is maintained. It does not go up. Here is the desmosome, and this is how cells interact with one another. So for example, etong cell na ito, yan, namatay of old age, or the immune system killed this cell because it harbored a pathogen. So, mamamatay ito, and its desmosome will also die with it, no? So, ano mangyayari? This will shrink, and the information that the desmosome is carrying, which is transmitted through cytoskeleton, etong tinuturo ko. The information that namatay na yung katabi niyang cell will not be able to reach this adjacent cell. Kasi namatay na siya, so wala na siyang isa-send na pressure information. So, kapag yun ay nangyari, this remaining cell na buhay pa will then understand it as namatay na yung katabi ko. I will have to divide, I will have to replicate myself so that I can replace the lost cell. Okay, so yun yung function ng desmosome. It is a point of contact but not as strong as the tight junction. Okay? And lastly, you have here the connexon, which is an intercellular communication, no? Through the connexon, ayan, nag-share ng molecules and ions ang loob ng isang cell to another. So for example, kulang ng sodium dito. The sodium that is from this cell will travel through the connexon and go to the other cell. No? So connexons are very rich in, for example, heart muscle cells, where the electricity in the form of ions in one heart muscle cell will travel through the connexon, and therefore the electricity will travel from one heart muscle cell to another heart muscle cell because of that connexon. Okay? Next, let's discuss how cellular transport occurs. So, These are lipid-soluble material, and because they are lipid, they will dissolve with the lipid. And the movement here is simple diffusion, which means that the substance will travel from a region of high concentration to a region of lower concentration. Okay? Um, so you have here a gradient. Because of that gradient and because of the solubility of these substances, matatagos nila yung cell membrane. They can penetrate the cell membrane easily. So as long as there is a gradient, there is a difference in concentration, papasok at papasok lang yung substance. Kung nag-equalize na yung concentration outside and inside, titigil na yung diffusion. Okay? Next is osmosis. And osmosis is a specific type of diffusion, in particular for water molecules. But remember, the cell membrane has a nonpolar or hydrophobic center. So, hindi yan matatagos ng water molecules. So, paano ngayon magdi-diffuse yung water molecule? It has to go through a channel which we call aquaporine. No? So, this is your aquaporine channel. So, this channel, para siyang, kumbaga, secret passage or isa siyang door, no? So, whenever this door or aquaporine channel opens, water from the outside will be able to move into the inside, bypassing this hydrophobic cell membrane. Okay? So, diffusion pa rin. Kung saan yung maraming tubig, siya ay gagalaw from that region to a region kung saan konti lang yung tubig. Okay? Next, you have facilitated diffusion. Kagaya din siya ng osmosis, but this time, what the channel is carrying is not water, but other substances like ions and sugars. Okay? So, dito, this is a facilitated diffusion for ions. No? This one would be facilitated diffusion for larger molecules. Kung mapapansin nyo, nag-change siya ng shape. Una, magbubukas siya to the extracellular fluid and the substance will go in. And then, after it has recognized the substance, sasabihin niya, this is the correct substance, so I will let this substance into the cell. So, it will then close the portion that orients with the extracellular fluid and open the portion that orients with the intracellular fluid. So, by this mechanism, by these proteins in the cell membrane will be able to allow certain substances to go in. And that is your selective permeability. Now let's go to the anatomy portion. We are done reviewing the more important cell biology concepts. So let's now go into terminologies. So in medical textbooks and in scientific textbooks, they will describe the human body using certain terms, no? And these terms are recognized throughout the world. So that if an author from, let's say, Iran tells us transverse plane, tayo na andito sa Pilipinas will understand that the transverse plane is this one. Okay, so this is language shared throughout the world for anatomical terminologies. Okay? So the human body is divided by planes. Okay? So if you have here the human, ayan, if you uh, if you divide the human body at the very middle, no? You divide it into left and right halves at the middle, pahaba, vertical. That plane that divides the human body is the median plane. Okay? If you have divided the human body into left and right halves, but not on the middle, no? For example, dito sa my shoulder, hindi pantay yung mapoproduce mo na halves, no? So, one half is larger, yung dito sa left, and the other half is smaller. So, hindi siya pantay kasi hindi siya sa gitna. This plane that divides the body so is called the sagittal plane. Okay? If you have a plane dividing the human body into front and back parts, that is your frontal or coronal plane. Okay? And if you divide the human body into an upper portion and a lower portion, a superior portion and an inferior portion, that plane that divides the human body is called the transverse or axial plane. Okay? So let's recap quickly. Divide into left and right halves. At the middle, median plane. Divide into left and right halves, but not the middle, that's the sagittal plane. Divide the body into front and back. Okay, that's the frontal or coronal plane. And divides the body into superior and inferior portions. Sa taas at saka sa baba, that's your axial or transverse plane. Next, we have some more terminologies. So, eto muna, etong tatlo. Superficial, ibig sabihin, nasa surface, nasa labas. Deep, ibig sabihin, mas malalim. Okay? Intermediate would mean it is between superficial and deep. So, let's describe using this illustration right here. The skin is superficial to the bone. On the other way around, the bone is deep to the skin. The muscle is intermediate between the skin and the bone. If you want to go up, you use the term superior. So it means nearer to the head. If you want to describe a structure that is below or downwards, you use the term inferior. So caudal is another term for inferior, which means nearer to the feet. So let's use those terms, superior and inferior. The umbilicus or belly button is inferior to the breast. On the other way around, the breast is superior to the umbilicus. Okay? So, if you want to describe a structure in front of another structure, use the term anterior. If you want to describe a term or a structure that is posterior to another, which is behind another structure, use the term posterior. So let's use that, okay? The breast is located anteriorly while the buttocks is located posteriorly. Okay? Nasa harap ang breast, the buttocks is behind or posterior. Okay? So let's continue with our terminologies. Medial would mean nearer to the median plane. So if this is the median plane, ayan, nahati niya yung katawan into equal because it is at the midline. No? Nahati niya yung katawan into left and right parts. What can we use to describe? No? We can use medial or lateral. So for example, the hand is lateral to the thigh if this is the position held by the patient. So lateral, ibig sabihin mas malayo siya sa median plane. The thigh is medial to the hand kasi mas malapit siya sa median plane. So ulitin ko, kapag mas malayo sa median plane, we use the term lateral. Kapag mas malapit sa medial plane, we use the term medial. Okay, so another example. The breast is medial to the upper arm. Okay? On the other way around, the arm is lateral to the breast. So I hope you get it through that example. We can also use the term proximal or distal to refer to locations regarding length. No? So for example, let's take the patient's lower extremity. You have to understand that the lower extremity is attached to the trunk. So this is the trunk. The lower extremity is attached to the trunk. The structures that are nearer to the point of attachment, we call them proximal structures. And the structures that are far to the point of attachment, we call those structures distal structures. So kapag mas malapit siya sa point of attachment, gagamitin natin yung term na proximal. Kapag mas malayo siya, gagamitin natin yung term na distal. Okay? So let's use that as an example. The feet is distal to the knee. The knee is proximal to the feet. No? Why? Kasi yung knee, mas malapit siya dito kung saan nag-attach yung lower extremity. So, the knee is proximal while the feet is distal. Okay? Another example, the hand and the elbow. The hand is distal while the elbow is proximal relative to the shoulder. Okay? Kung yung point of reference mo ay ang shoulder, then the elbow is proximal and the hand is distal. Okay? So, pwede din we use it this way. Distal to the elbow is the hand. No? So, pwede din ganun yung pagkakasentence natin. Proximal to the hand is the elbow. So, pwede din ganun. And last point, in our introduction to human anatomy and physiology is the concept of homeostasis. Homeostasis would mean that the body is in a state of normal and the body would want to maintain that state of being normal. So we have here an example of a homeostatic mechanism. What if the human body has low blood pressure? So for example, the low blood pressure is because the blood volume has decreased. So kumonte yung dugo. So dahil kumonte yung dugo, yung blood pressure ay bumaba. So what does the body do? It will try to increase blood pressure so that it goes back to normal. The process of increasing the blood pressure so that it goes back to normal is a homeostatic mechanism. No? So we use the term homeostasis to define a process or to define a state of normalcy. Okay? So let's use that example. Bumaba ang blood volume, so bumaba ang blood pressure. Anong gagawin ng katawan? The kidneys will then retain the water and the salt so that the blood volume increases. As the blood volume increases again, the stroke volume or the amount of blood pumped by the heart with each beat goes up. And so the cardiac output or the amount of blood pumped by the heart in 1 minute goes up. And that will translate to increased arterial blood pressure. Nagsimula tayo with low blood pressure and we ended up with high blood pressure back towards the normal. Okay, so that is homeostasis. So that is the end of our lesson. We touched about the cell. We touched about how the cell progressively makes up an organism. We touched how the cell membrane is unique. We talked about how substances can enter the cell. And we talked about uniformly observed terminologies for anatomy, particularly the planes, and in particular, anatomical terms of reference. For example, anterior, posterior, lateral, medial, distal, proximal, superior, inferior, yun yung na-discuss natin kanina. Superficial, intermediate, and deep. And lastly, we talked about homeostatic mechanisms or homeostasis. So thank you for listening.